The auction of despair. The market smelled of rust and sweat. The air was thick with smoke from burning torches, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Creatures of all shapes and sizes filled the space, some in cages, others chained to metal poles. The auction house was loud with shouting, laughter, and the desperate cries of those being sold. Vena sat on the cold ground, her wrists shackled together with heavy iron cuffs. She could barely feel her legs after hours of kneeling. Her once bright green skin was covered in dirt and bruises. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying did nothing. A large alien with gray, leathery skin and 4 yellow eyes stomped toward her. He was her owner, a slave trader known as Krolek. He grabbed her chain and yanked her forward, making her stumble. "You will be sold today," Krolek growled. "Try to look useful, or I will feed you to the hounds." Vena said nothing. She knew better than to talk back. Krolek dragged her to the center of the auction stage. Around her, dozens of aliens gathered, all eager to buy. Some were wealthy merchants looking for workers. Others were cruel warlords seeking entertainment. The worst ones were the collectors, beings who kept slaves not for labor, but for their twisted amusement. The auctioneer, a thin creature with blue skin and sharp teeth, banged his staff against the floor. "Next, we have a rare specimen, a Xilari female, young and strong, perfect for any task, obedient and quiet." His voice echoed through the hall. "Starting bid, 500 credits." Vena kept her head down. She had been sold before, passed from one master to another like an object. Each time, it got worse. Each time, she lost a little more of herself. A thick-furred alien with curved horns raised his hand. 500. Another, a reptilian creature in golden robes, snorted. 600. The bids climbed higher. Vena did not listen. It didn't matter who won. The result would be the same. Then, a new voice cut through the noise. 2,000 credits. The room fell silent. Even the auctioneer hesitated. Vena dared to lift her head. A human stood at the edge of the crowd. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket with a utility belt around his waist. His face was calm, unreadable. Unlike the others, he did not leer at her or whisper to those around him. He simply stood there, waiting. Krolek narrowed his eyes. "A human," he sneered. "What would you want with a slave, Terran?" The human's expression did not change. "That is my business." The auctioneer, seeing an opportunity, quickly spoke. 2,000. Going once. "I protest." The golden-robed reptilian slammed his fist on the table. "I bid 3,000. Gasps rippled through the crowd. That was more than any slave had ever been sold for in this auction. The reptilian's mouth snapped shut. Even Krolek looked uncertain. The auctioneer grinned. 3,000. Going once. Going twice. Sold. He banged his staff against the floor. It was done. Vena felt the heavy chain around her neck loosen as Krolek unhooked it. He shoved her toward the human. "She's yours, Terran. If she gives you trouble, just cut off a finger or two. She'll learn fast." The human did not respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small device, and tossed it to Krolek. "Transfer complete," he said. Krolek checked the device and grinned. "Pleasure doing business with you." Vena expected the human to grab her roughly, like all the others had. But he didn't touch her at all. He simply turned and walked toward the exit. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she felt a tug. Her shackles were connected to a small metal rod in his hand. A shock collar. She had seen those before. If she tried to run, he could activate it and send a painful surge of electricity through her body. Her stomach twisted. Of course, he was just like the rest. She followed him out of the auction house, stepping into the cold night air. The marketplace outside was alive with movement. Vendors selling strange foods, machines hovering past, drunken aliens laughing in the streets. But none of it mattered. They stopped near a sleek, black spaceship docked at the edge of the market. The human pressed a button on his wrist device, and the ship's door slid open with a soft hiss. Vena hesitated at the threshold. The human turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to be afraid," he said. Vena stared at him. Fear. She was not afraid. Fear was something she had run out of long ago. The human sighed and reached into his jacket. She flinched, expecting a weapon. But instead, he pulled out a small key. Without a word, he knelt and unlocked her shackles. The heavy metal cuffs fell to the ground with a dull clank. Vena's breath caught in her throat. She rubbed her wrists, barely believing what just happened. "Come inside," the human said, stepping into the ship. "You can rest. Eat. No chains." She didn't move. This was a trick. It had to be. No one bought a slave just to free them. He turned back to her, his voice softer this time. "My name is Rylan. You don't have to trust me, but you are not a prisoner here." Then he disappeared into the ship. Vena stood there, staring at the open door. This was not how it was supposed to happen. She was supposed to be dragged, beaten, locked away. But instead, she was given a choice, and she did not know what to do with it. The kindness of a monster. Vena stood outside the open door of the spaceship, her wrists still tingling from where the shackles had been. The cold night wind blew past her, carrying the distant noise of the market. The laughter, the shouts, the cries of others who weren't as lucky as her. But was she really lucky? Her eyes shifted to the inside of the ship, where the human, Rylan, had disappeared. The doorway was open, the dim yellow light from within casting a long shadow across the ground. A trap. It had to be. No one paid 3,000 credits just to let a slave walk free. Vena took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. She had no idea where she would go. No money, no food, no allies. But anything was better than walking willingly into another prison. Before she could make up her mind, a voice called out from inside. "You can either stand there all night or come in." She froze. There was no anger in his tone. No threats. Just a statement. Her hands curled into fists. She had seen many kinds of masters. Some were brutal from the start, enjoying the sight of a slave trembling before them. Others played games, pretending to be kind before revealing their true nature. Rylan had freed her wrists, but he still had the shock collar controller. He still owned her. Her throat tightened. This was just another game. But she had no choice. Swallowing her fear, Vena stepped inside the ship. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slid shut behind her with a soft hiss. Her whole body tensed. She glanced around quickly, searching for any signs of danger. The interior of the ship was strange. It wasn't the dark, filthy prison she had expected. The walls were made of smooth, dark metal, lined with glowing blue strips. The floor was clean. The air smelled of something fresh, not the stench of blood and sweat she had grown used to. The room she entered seemed to be a cargo bay, with storage crates neatly stacked against the walls. A narrow hallway led deeper into the ship, where she could hear Rylan moving. A soft beep sounded from above, and a new voice spoke, smooth, mechanical, and distinctly female. Unregistered life form detected. Identity unknown. Vena's heart pounded. "It's fine, SEORI." Rylan's voice responded from deeper inside. There was a brief pause. Then the voice, now calmer, said, "Acknowledged. Security protocols remain on standby." Vena had never seen a ship with an AI before. Only the wealthiest slavers had such luxuries, and yet here she was, standing in one. Rylan reappeared from the hallway, carrying a small tray. He placed it on a nearby table and stepped back. "Eat." Vena narrowed her eyes at the food. 2 protein bars and a small container of water. She didn't move. She had seen this trick before. Some masters would give food laced with chemicals to weaken slaves. Others would wait until hunger broke them, forcing them to beg. Rylan sighed, as if he could read her thoughts. Without hesitation, he picked up one of the protein bars, unwrapped it, and took a bite. He chewed, swallowed, then placed it back on the tray. It's not poisoned. Still, she didn't move. He picked up the water, took a sip, and placed it back down. Not drugged either. Vena stared at him, waiting for the catch. When none came, she reached out, grabbed the second protein bar, and took a small bite. It was dry and tasteless, but it was food. Her stomach ached as she chewed, reminding her how long it had been since she had eaten anything real. She finished it in seconds. Ryland didn't comment. He just watched. Not like a master observing his property, but something else. Something curious. Vena took the water and drank. She expected him to ask questions, to demand something in return. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. "What's your name?" The question caught her off guard. Slaves had no names. Masters called them whatever they pleased. Creature, girl, thing. Some had numbers burned into their skin. No one had ever asked before. She hesitated before whispering, "Vena." Ryland nodded as if that was a normal response. "All right, Vena. You have two choices." Her body tensed. Here it was. The moment he revealed his true intentions. He continued, "You can leave at the next station, and you'll be free. No chains, no debts, or," he tilted his head slightly, "you can stay here, work on the ship, get paid, make your own choices." Vena stared at him. Lies. This had to be a lie. "You bought me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Slaves do not get choices." Ryland's expression darkened. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes. Anger. Not at her, but at something else. "I don't own you," he said firmly. "No one does." His words hit her like a punch to the chest. "No one owns me." It was impossible. Yet, he had taken off her shackles. He had given her food. He had not hurt her. The ship was silent except for the faint hum of the engines. Vena's hands trembled. This was a trick. It had to be. Ryland sighed again and turned toward the hallway. "You can think about it. There's a room down the hall. Second door on the left. If you want to sleep, it's yours." With that, he walked away, disappearing into another section of the ship. Vena stood there, staring at the tray, the empty water container, the open hallway. No chains, no guards, no orders. She turned toward the exit, her heart pounding. If she ran now, he might not even stop her. She could disappear into the market, find another way to survive. But where would she go? The thought sent a deep, unfamiliar ache through her chest. She had never had a choice before, and she didn't know what to do with one now. The first lesson in humanity. Vena did not sleep. She sat on the floor of the small room Ryland had pointed out, her back pressed against the cold metal wall. The bed, soft and clean, remained untouched. She had learned long ago that comfort was a trap, a trick used by masters to make their slaves let down their guard. Her fingers ran over her bare wrists. No chains, no pain collars. Yet, the weight of her past still clung to her like an invisible shackle. She could run. She could leave the moment this ship docked at the next station. But where would she go? No answer came. The next morning, or at least what she assumed was morning, Vena heard footsteps outside her door. She snapped to attention, every muscle in her body tense. A voice called from the other side. "Are you awake?" "Ryland." Vena said nothing. After a pause, the door slid open. Ryland leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't carrying a weapon. No whip, no shock baton. Just standing there, looking at her like a person. "The ship needs maintenance," he said casually. "Come help." Vena's brows furrowed. Was this an order? A test? A way to see if she was useful? She didn't move. Ryland tilted his head. "It's either that or you sit here all day doing nothing. Up to you." Vena slowly stood, Her legs were still weak from weeks of mistreatment, but she masked it well. She followed him out into the hallway, her senses sharp, waiting for a sign, any sign, that this was a trap. The ship was quiet. It was nothing like the massive, chaotic vessels she had been forced to work on before. Those had been dark, dirty, filled with the sound of screaming and metal clashing against metal. This ship, the Starborn, was small, sleek. Every surface was polished. The glowing blue lights along the walls pulsed softly, like the heartbeat of a living thing. Ryland led her to the engine room. The doors slid open with a faint hiss, revealing a chamber filled with machines humming in a steady rhythm. Vena hesitated at the entrance. "You ever worked on a ship before?" Ryland asked, already kneeling beside an open panel. She clenched her fists. Yes, slaves worked everywhere. Ships, mines, factories. Their hands built empires, but they never owned anything. "Good," he said, tossing her a small tool. She caught it automatically. "Help me check these stabilizers." Vena looked down at the tool. She knew what it was. She knew what it did. But why was he asking her? She hesitated. Ryland arched a brow. "What's wrong?" She lifted her gaze to his. "What happens if I refuse?" Ryland blinked, as if the question had never even crossed his mind. "I guess you don't help," he said with a shrug. "And I do it alone." Vena stared at him. No punishment, no threats. The concept was so foreign, she almost laughed. Her fingers tightened around the tool. Silently, she knelt beside him and started working. Minutes passed, then an hour. Ryland didn't speak much, only giving brief instructions when necessary. He didn't hover over her shoulder, didn't correct her needlessly. Vena worked with quick, precise movements, muscle memory kicking in. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot that she was supposed to be afraid. Then, something strange happened. Ryland sat back, stretched his arms, and let out a satisfied sigh. "Not bad," he said. "You're better at this than I expected." Vena stiffened. She didn't know how to respond to praise. Slaves were never praised. If they did something well, it was expected. If they failed, they were punished. She simply stared at him, unsure. Ryland smirked. "Relax, it's a compliment." Vena's grip on the tool tightened. "Why?" He raised a brow. "Why what?" "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "Why did you buy me if you're not going to use me?" Ryland exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. For the first time, he looked hesitant. "I told you," he said. "I don't own you." Vena shook her head. "That doesn't answer my question." Ryland studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he stood and walked over to a storage compartment. He pressed a button, and the panel slid open. Inside was a small, old-looking case. He pulled it out, set it on the floor between them, and opened it. Vena's breath caught. Inside the case were metal tags, worn, scratched, each one carrying names engraved into the surface. She had seen tags like these before. They belonged to soldiers. "My old squad," Ryland said quietly. His voice was different now. Not casual, not teasing. Vena hesitated. "They're dead." Ryland nodded. "They were killed in a war we shouldn't have fought." Vena looked back down at the tags. "There were so many. I saw too many people taken," Ryland continued. "People who didn't deserve what happened to them. And I couldn't stop it." His fingers brushed against the tags before he closed the case again. "This," he gestured between them. "This is me trying to do at least one thing right." Vena had no words. She didn't understand humans. She had been told they were selfish, dangerous, conquerors who only took what they wanted. But this one confused her. She looked at Ryland again, trying to see through his words, to find the hidden trick. But there was none. He was serious. And for the first time in her life, Vena felt something she had never dared to feel before. Hope. She lowered her gaze. Her hands trembled slightly. Ryland stood, brushing off his hands. "We'll be docking at a station tomorrow. You can leave then if you want." Vena hesitated before asking, "And if I stay?" Ryland smiled slightly. "Then we keep moving." Vena's heart pounded. For the first time, she had a real choice, and she had no idea what to do with it. Hunted. The station came into view, a massive ring of steel and neon lights orbiting a cold, gray moon. From the cockpit, Vena could see hundreds of ships docked along its sides, some sleek and elegant, others rusted and barely holding together. The traffic of space vessels moved in slow, careful patterns, guided by the blinking signals of docking bays. Her hands curled into fists. This was it. Her chance to leave. She stood behind Ryland, watching as he steered the starboard toward their assigned dock. The ship's AI, HFY, announced the clearance codes in a smooth mechanical voice. Ryland leaned back in his chair. "You sure you don't want to stay on the ship? Some of these outer rim stations aren't exactly friendly." Vena hesitated. She should leave. She needed to leave. And yet, her eyes flickered to Ryland. He had not locked her up, had not threatened her, had not treated her like an object. Even now, he gave her the choice. She had spent her entire life being forced into decisions. This was the first time anyone had let her decide for herself. "Are you going for supplies?" she asked, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. Ryland nodded. "Fuel, food, and spare parts." Vena crossed her arms. "I'll go with you." Ryland smiled slightly. "Didn't think you were the shopping type." Vena scowled. "If I were escaping, would you stop me?" Ryland studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "No." Her stomach twisted. She didn't know why. "Then let's go," she muttered. The ship docked with a soft thud. The doors unlocked with a hiss, and a ramp extended onto the metal floor of the station. The moment Vena stepped out, the air changed. The station smelled of fuel, burning metal, and sweat. People, humans, aliens, machines, moved in every direction. Some were traders, shouting prices for weapons and supplies. Others were mercenaries, armored and armed, their eyes scanning for trouble. Vena kept close to Ryland as they entered the marketplace. She could feel the stares. She wasn't wearing chains anymore, but she still felt them. The weight of being looked at, of being recognized. Slavery was illegal in some parts of the galaxy, but in places like this, no one cared. She didn't belong here. And yet she followed Ryland as he weaved through the crowd, stopping at different stalls. He bartered for fuel cells, inspected engine parts, and argued with a food vendor over the price of ration packs. He was so normal. Like he wasn't worried. Like he wasn't looking over his shoulder. But Vena was. She saw them before Ryland did. A group of armored men near the edge of the market. They weren't shopping. They weren't talking. They were watching. Watching them. Vena felt the hair on her arms rise. Her entire body tensed. "Ryland," she whispered. He glanced at her, then followed her gaze. His easy expression darkened. "Trouble." Vena nodded. "They're bounty hunters." Ryland exhaled sharply. "Great." They moved. Vena barely had time to react before Ryland grabbed her wrist and pulled her into a side alley, weaving between crates and empty stalls. She wasn't used to running away. She was used to being the one chased. They reached a narrow maintenance corridor, dimly lit and abandoned. Ryland pressed his back against the wall, pulling her with him. He checked his wrist device. "HFY, we've got company. Lock down the ship and prepare for emergency departure." "Understood, Captain," the AI's voice responded in his earpiece. Vena pressed her palms against the cold wall, her breath shallow. She could hear footsteps. Slow, heavy, calculated. The hunters weren't rushing. They were hunting. "Who are they?" she asked quietly. Ryland's jaw tightened. "People I pissed off a long time ago." That wasn't an answer. But now wasn't the time to argue. A shadow moved at the alley's entrance. Vena's instincts screamed. She grabbed Ryland's sleeve and pulled, just as a blaster shot ripped through the air, hitting the spot where his head had been a second ago. Ryland swore. They ran. Vena heard more shots behind them, the sharp sound bouncing off the metal walls. Ryland fired back, but they were outnumbered. She saw a loading dock up ahead, leading to a service tunnel. "Left," she shouted. Ryland didn't hesitate. He trusted her call and darted through the opening. The tunnel led them into a docking bay filled with rusted cargo ships. Some were abandoned. Others were being loaded by workers who didn't even glance their way. Vena skidded to a stop behind a stack of crates, her pulse racing. Ryland crouched beside her. "Okay. Ideas." Vena's mind raced. "They're tracking you, not me." Ryland frowned. "And I can distract them." Ryland's expression turned sharp. "Not happening." She clenched her teeth. "I know how to hide. I know how to move through places like this. You don't." Ryland's jaw tightened. Then, from above, a voice called out. "Ryland Voss." The lead bounty hunter stood on the upper level, flanked by his men. His voice echoed through the bay. "You can run, but you can't hide. Come out now, and we'll make this quick." Vena's blood ran cold. The hunter wasn't talking to her. They only wanted Ryland, because he was the one with the bounty. She grabbed his arm. "You need to go." Ryland shook his head. "Not without you." Vena didn't understand him. He had nothing to gain from saving her, nothing to lose by leaving her behind. But he wouldn't. She had spent her entire life being discarded, used, and thrown away. And now, for the first time, someone refused to leave her. Vena took a shaky breath. Then she made her choice. She turned toward the control panel near the loading dock. A ship was being prepped for launch, one of the heavy freighters. If she could override the system. She sprinted before Ryland could stop her. Her fingers flew over the controls, hacking into the freighter's automated systems. "Vena." Ryland hissed. The engines roared to life. A deep boom echoed through the bay as the freighter's thrusters overloaded. Smoke and alarms filled the air. The bounty hunters shouted in confusion. Ryland grabbed her hand. "Come on." They ran. Through the smoke, through the chaos, straight back to the starboard. The ship's doors opened just in time, and they stumbled inside. Ryland slapped the controls. The engines roared. The ship lifted. Vena barely had time to collapse into a chair before the station disappeared beneath them, swallowed by the darkness of space. She was breathing hard. Ryland turned to her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Vena met his eyes. "Yes, I did." For the first time, she had chosen to stay. And she wasn't running anymore. The ghosts of the past. The hum of the ship's engines filled the air, steady and familiar. Vena sat in the co-pilot's seat, her fingers curled tightly around the armrests. Her heart still pounded from their narrow escape. The bounty hunters, the gunfire, the blaring alarms. She could still hear them echoing in her head. But they had made it. For now. Ryland sat in the pilot's chair, eyes locked on the control panel as he adjusted their course. His jaw was tight, his fingers drumming against the dashboard in a slow, restless rhythm. He had barely said a word since they left the station. Finally, he exhaled and leaned back. "Well," he muttered, "that could have gone worse." Vena turned to him, her sharp green eyes narrowing. "We were almost killed." Ryland smirked. "Almost is the important part." Vena didn't smile. She couldn't. Who were they? Ryland ran a hand through his dark hair. "Bounty hunters." "I know that," she said impatiently. "But why were they after you?" Ryland was silent. That told her everything. "You're a criminal," she said, studying him carefully. Ryland snorted. "Depends on who you ask." Vena's fingers curled tighter around the armrests. She should have known. No one was truly kind. She had spent her whole life around liars, Masters who promised mercy and gave only pain. Traders who claimed their slaves would be treated well before sending them to the pits. And now, this human, this Rylan, had tricked her too. She should have left. She should have run. Rylan must have seen the change in her expression, because his smirk faded. His voice, when he spoke again, was quiet. "You think I lied to you?" Vena didn't answer. Rylan let out a slow breath and turned his chair to face her fully. "You want the truth?" he asked. She folded her arms. "Always." Rylan was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "I was a soldier. A long time ago. Fought for the Galactic Union." Vena frowned. The Galactic Union. An alliance of powerful species, including humans, the ones who claimed to bring order to the galaxy. She had never trusted them. Rylan continued. "I followed orders, did what I was told. But then one day, I saw something I couldn't ignore." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something metal. He tossed it onto the dashboard. Dog tags, like the ones in the case he had shown her before. But these ones weren't his. Vena hesitated before picking them up. She turned them over in her hand, reading the engraving. The name wasn't human. It belonged to a Tarscan, a species that had nearly been wiped out a decade ago. She looked up. Rylan's expression was hard, his eyes shadowed. "I was sent to their planet," he said. "My unit was told we were there to protect them, that they were under threat from an enemy force." He exhaled sharply. That was a lie. Vena's stomach twisted. The Union wanted the planet's resources. They didn't care about the people living there. And when the Tarscans refused to give up their land, the Union branded them as terrorists, ordered us to put them down. Vena gripped the tags tightly. "And you followed orders." Rylan's face darkened. At first, silence. Then he continued, his voice quieter now. "I realized the truth too late. By the time I turned against my commanders, the damage was done. The Tarscans were wiped out. The survivors, sold into slavery." Vena's breath caught. She had known suffering. She had lived it. But to hear it like this, from him, was different. Rylan leaned back, his gaze distant. "I tried to stop it," he said. "I fought my own people, got labeled a traitor, hunted across the galaxy." He let out a bitter chuckle. "Now, I'm worth more dead than alive." Vena swallowed hard. She looked down at the tags in her hands. These weren't just metal. They were names, people, lost and forgotten. Finally, she spoke. "Why did you buy me?" Rylan met her eyes. "Because I saw what happened to the Tarscans, and I swore I'd never let it happen again." His words settled deep inside her. She didn't trust easily. She couldn't. But something in his voice, something in his eyes. It felt real. Vena slowly placed the dog tags back on the dashboard. She had spent her whole life surrounded by cruelty, by those who took and took without care. And now, sitting in this chair, listening to this human's confession, she realized something terrifying. She believed him. For the next hour, they sat in silence, drifting through space. Rylan focused on the controls. Vena focused on her thoughts. Then an alarm beeped. Rylan's expression hardened. "We've got company." Vena's stomach dropped. The bounty hunters. Rylan shook his head. No. The screen in front of them showed a new reading. An incoming transmission. Vena frowned. "Who is it?" Rylan hesitated before answering. "The Galactic Union." Vena's blood went cold. And just like that, she realized. The past wasn't done with them yet. The price of freedom. The cockpit lights flickered as the incoming transmission signal pulsed across the dashboard. Vena tensed, her body rigid as she stared at the screen. The Galactic Union. The very organization that had wiped out the Tarscans. The same one that had branded Rylan a traitor. And now, they were calling. Rylan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He didn't move to answer. Didn't even reach for the controls. Vena clenched her fists. Are you going to answer it? Rylan didn't look at her. I don't know. A second pulse. Louder. More urgent. Vena's throat tightened. Do they know we're here? Rylan hesitated before nodding. If they're calling, they know. Her blood ran cold. She had spent years hiding from slavers, from hunters, from people who saw her as nothing more than property. The Galactic Union. They were worse. They didn't just use people. They erased them. Another pulse. Vena's hands twitched toward the controls. Then we run. Rylan exhaled, his fingers tapping against the console. He was thinking, calculating. Running might not be an option, he muttered. Vena's eyes narrowed. Then what, human? You surrender? Rylan shot her a look. I don't surrender. The transmission beeped again, and this time it auto-connected. The screen flickered. A woman's face appeared. A human with sharp features, dark eyes, and a uniform lined with silver trim. The Galactic Union's crest gleamed on her chest. Vena recognized her kind immediately. A commander, high-ranking, dangerous. The woman's expression was cold, unreadable. But when she spoke, her voice was calm. Rylan Voss. Vena felt Rylan tense beside her. You've been difficult to find, the woman continued, but not impossible. Rylan's face remained neutral. That's flattering. The woman's lips twitched in the ghost of a smirk. You always had a habit of making things difficult. Vena's heart pounded. This wasn't just an officer. This woman knew him. She stepped forward. Who is she? The woman's gaze flickered to her, assessing, calculating. She, Rylan muttered, is Admiral Celine Cordova. Vena's blood chilled. She had heard that name before. Cordova was a legend, a ruthless strategist, a soldier who had crushed rebellions and silenced entire planets. And now she was staring at them through the screen. I assume this isn't a social call, Rylan said, leaning back in his chair. Cordova's expression didn't change. I have an offer for you. Rylan let out a short, bitter laugh. An offer? That's rich. Cordova ignored the sarcasm. The Union is willing to let the past go. Vena stiffened. Rylan frowned. What? You were one of our best, Cordova continued. And despite your betrayal, the Union is prepared to make a deal. Rylan leaned forward. What kind of deal? Cordova's gaze flickered to Vena. Surrender yourself. Cooperate. And we will grant you amnesty. Vena's stomach twisted. Rylan went still. Completely, utterly still. Then, very softly, he said, and what happens to her? Cordova didn't blink. The auxiliary slave. She tilted her head slightly. She isn't our concern. Vena felt something hot and sharp rise in her chest. Not our concern. That was what people like Cordova always said. That was what her captors had said when they had taken her kind in chains. And she was so sick of hearing it. But before she could speak, Rylan did. His voice was sharp, hard. She's not a slave. Cordova studied him. Then she's a liability. Vena's breath caught. For a moment, the ship was silent. Then Rylan exhaled, shaking his head. You haven't changed. Cordova's expression flickered with something unreadable. The galaxy is changing, Rylan, she said. You don't have to be on the wrong side of it. Rylan smirked, but it was bitter. And what side is that? The winning one. The word sent a shiver down Vena's spine. Rylan sat back, arms crossed. I assume I get time to think about it. Cordova's lips curved slightly. You have 1 hour. The transmission cut. The screen went black. The silence that followed was thick. Vena turned to Rylan. You're not actually considering this. Rylan didn't answer immediately. He rubbed his hands over his face, exhaling slowly. I need to think. Vena's fists clenched. What is there to think about? They want you in chains or dead. Rylan shot her a sharp look. And if I don't go, they'll hunt us forever. Vena hesitated. That part was true. If the Galactic Union wanted Rylan, they would never stop. Her chest ached with frustration. She wasn't used to caring about someone else's survival, but she had spent her entire life running. And now, for the first time, she had found something. Someone who had given her a choice. She wasn't going to let him throw that away. She grabbed his arm. Rylan. He met her gaze. You saved me, she said quietly. Now let me do the same for you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rylan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I have a really bad feeling about this, he muttered. Vena's lips twitched. Good. That means you're thinking clearly. Rylan let out a breathless chuckle. Then, his expression hardened. All right, he said. No more running. Vena felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about escape anymore. This was about fighting back. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. A new beginning. The hum of the Starborn's engines filled the silence in the cockpit, a steady rhythm beneath the weight of their decision. Rylan's fingers tapped restlessly against the control panel, his mind racing through possibilities. 1 hour. That was all the time they had before the Galactic Union expected an answer, and that answer would change everything. Vena sat across from him, watching him carefully. There was no fear in her gaze, only determination. She had made her choice. Now it was his turn. 30 minutes later, the ship's AI, HFY, pulsed a quiet alert. Captain, incoming message from Admiral Cordova. The 1-hour deadline approaches. Rylan exhaled through his nose. Patch it through. The screen flickered to life. Cordova's face appeared once more, as unreadable as before. Your decision. Rylan glanced at Vena. She gave him a single firm nod. Rylan leaned forward, crossing his arms. Here's my offer, Cordova. Cordova's expression remained neutral. Go on. You leave us alone. You wipe the bounty off my head. You forget you ever found me. Silence. Then Cordova's lips curled slightly. You're not in a position to negotiate. Rylan smirked. Neither are you. He pressed a button on the console. The screen split, showing a second live feed. A Union warship, stationed just outside a nearby asteroid belt. Cordova's expression barely shifted, but Rylan knew he had her attention. You were expecting me to run, he said, or to surrender. But instead, I had already scanned the area for your backup. He nodded at the screen. Nice ship, by the way. Cordova's jaw tightened. You sent a stealth warship after me, Rylan continued, which means this isn't just a bounty retrieval mission. This is personal. Vena watched Cordova carefully, noting the small shifts in her posture. He was right. This wasn't just about Rylan being a fugitive. Cordova wanted him alive. Rylan leaned back, satisfied. So here's what happens next. You either call off the hunt, or I send this transmission to every outlaw, mercenary, and rival faction in the galaxy. Cordova's eyes narrowed. You wouldn't. Rylan grinned. I would. The weight of his words hung in the air. Cordova knew what it meant. If word got out that the Galactic Union had secretly deployed a warship to capture one man, it would spark questions, unwanted attention, whispers of corruption. They couldn't afford that. Finally, Cordova exhaled, tilting her head slightly. You always were difficult, Rylan. I try my best. A pause. Then, Cordova's voice turned colder. The bounty will be lifted. For now. But don't mistake this for mercy. Rylan's smirk didn't fade. Oh, I never do. The transmission cut. And just like that, it was over. The aftermath. Rylan let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. Well, that went better than expected. Vena folded her arms. So that's it. We're free. Rylan scoffed. Hardly. He pointed at the screen, where the warship had just vanished from their sensors. They'll pull the bounty for now, But Cordova doesn't forget. He glanced at Vena. We made an enemy today. Vena smirked slightly. We already had enemies. Rylan chuckled, shaking his head. Fair point. Silence settled between them. For the first time in years, Vena felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, but possibility. She had spent her whole life waiting for the next master, the next order, the next cage. But now, for the first time, she had choices. She turned to Rylan. What now? Rylan arched a brow. What do you mean? I mean, she hesitated. Where do we go? Rylan studied her for a long moment. Then, without warning, he tossed her a small, sleek device. Vena caught it automatically, glancing down at the screen. A star map. Rylan leaned back, a smirk tugging at his lips. Your choice. Vena's eyes widened. She looked at the map. She could pick anywhere. Anywhere. A slow smile spread across her lips. For the first time in her life, she was free. And she wasn't going to waste it. Epilogue. A new beginning. As the Starborn soared into the darkness, neither of them looked back. There was no past anymore. Only the future, and it belonged to them.